So thank you for those that are online. We might get started, otherwise we're going to run out of time. My name is Catherine Collier and I'm the Deputy Chair of the Victorian chapter of the ACRS, and I'm the manager at MeTech Driver Training. So we're a not-for-profit road safety organisation that does driver education and training at our facility in Bayswater North. So on behalf of everyone at the ACRS Vic chapter, welcome to our lunchbox chat today, the monetary impacts of speed. And first of all, I'd like to do acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the many First Nations of Australia who continue to be the sovereign custodians of their countries and the sovereignty of the Maori in New Zealand. We acknowledge the ongoing traditional custodians of the lands on which we live, work and learn, pay our respects to elders who have passed on the legacy of their knowledge and culture to the future generations. May this sharing of knowledge through Maturanga Maori and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of knowing, being and doing guide you with wisdom and courage as it enhances our collective futures. So thank you for that. Today we have two speakers who will be sharing their work, some of their work and their views on the monetary impacts of speed. We all know about the human costs of speed, but we're going to take it to that next step. So first up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Brett Hughes, and then we'll be hearing from Emeritus Professor Max Cameron after that, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So pop your questions in the chat. We're going to do all the questions at the end. And Chris Harrison, the chapter chair, will be handling the Q&A. So thank you for that, Chris. So thanks for joining today. First of all, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Brett Hughes. He is the principal of P7 Safety, adjunct research, Curtin University. There are many, many things that go behind his name. I'm not going to go into them all, but he's a professional engineer with over 40 years experience in engineering, policy, planning and research for all modes of transport. He's now an independent transport researcher, an advocate and an adjunct researcher at Curtin University. Brett is passionate about investing in people and applying systems approaches to all transport issues that result in integrated, multifaceted and balanced solutions that are appropriate for the increasingly difficult and unpredictable future. He currently contributes to industry associations, policy papers and advocates for improved railway level crossing safety. Brett has authored 40 papers on diverse transport topics, and his PhD thesis, A Comprehensive Framework for Future Road Safety Strategies, is internationally recognised and cited. Previously, Brett has held senior executive and management positions in government, university and the Australasian Railway Association, and has worked as a principal consultant. So thank you, Brett. We're going to have 10 minutes from each of our speakers, and then we'll be going into Q&A. So Brett, if you're ready, we will start with you.
Right. Thanks for the introduction, and in particular, thanks for inviting me to speak to you. It's great to be in Melbourne for a change for a few weeks. Not that that makes any difference these days. So let me just check that you can see my screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yep, good. So the first thing to recognise about speed is that it's a complex issue within the greater context of road safety, which is a complex issue itself. And complex systems defy simple analysis and therefore simple solutions. There's no doubt that speed is a critical issue for road safety, but vehicle movement is also essential for transport, so managing it is crucial. Managing speed isn't just about speed zoning though, although some might try and convince us that it is. We need to go back to basics at times and not jump to conclusions. speed management is actually a much larger topic than I can deal with today. So I'll just give you a few observations, provide some context, especially for Max, and leave you with some things to think about. Now, right. The first point about speed is that the term itself is ambiguous. Speed is simply velocity or distance over time, meters per second or kilometers per hour. But in road safety, speed can be many different things. It can be average or 85th percentile or posted speed limit or impact speed or according to the conditions, particularly for regulatory purposes. As an example, the sign that you see on the right is wrong. It doesn't convey what it is intended to. It's supposed to apply to the loaded mass of trucks, and instead it applies to the registered gross combination maximum. So it actually applies to all vehicles with a GCM over 4.5 tonne, whether they're loaded or not. So it would include vehicles like Land Cruisers and Ford Rangers. Because speed is a complex issue, we need to apply systems approaches. The ACRS policy paper on a new systems approach to road safety was endorsed last year, and it's the subject of an online workshop later this week. It describes a comprehensive systems approach, which includes being clear about the purpose, in this case for speed management, applying safe system principles, involving all of the people and organisations who can collaboratively contribute to improvements, applying all of the countermeasures together in an integrated fashion that can give the best results in all parts of the system, and diligently applying analysis, policy, planning, design, implementation, and research processes. And clearly that's not happening across road safety as a whole at the moment, and it needs to apply to managing speed. One of the important considerations about speed is the context. The issue of speed depends on many factors like those in this list. So speed management needs to take account of all of these contextual considerations. I'll tell you that when I'm dragging my caravan around Australia outside the towns, I'm not very interested in the speed limit. My safety depends much more on much more than that, such as how much water I have in the tanks, where the wind is coming from, and how rutted the road is. So let's think a little bit about application. We know that safe crash speeds are 30, 50, 70 kilometres an hour, depending on the type of crash. But the first pedestrian death in the UK occurred with a vehicle travelling at the, quote, reckless speed of 4 miles per hour, or 6.4 kilometres per hour, when the speed limit was 14 miles per hour, or 23 kilometres an hour. So the 30, 50, 70 safe speed numbers aren't cast in stone. They can be quite variable and probably disputable, but we'd have to choose something. This chart shows an example of a range of safe speeds. And secondly, they are impact speeds, not legal speeds. But some try and convince us that they are the same. These are collision speeds, not speed zones. When we try and apply this information, we run into some practical difficulties. The chart shows safe impact speeds for serious injuries on the left ranges, which are obviously much lower than fatality speeds. If we are to get to 0 serious injuries, then we would need to apply much lower safe speeds. The safe speed for a right angle crash is 50 kilometres an hour. So if we try and apply that in principle, then it should be applied to all roads except controlled access highways or expressways, because all other roads have intersections and driveways, all rural roads except the freeways, and all intersections. And as vehicle design and technology changes, then so will safe speeds. Unfortunately, this is sometimes a positive effect, but in other times it's very detrimental, such as the move towards high flat-fronted SUVs. So I advocate for three things. Firstly, a risk-based approach. Secondly, comprehensive speed management, not simplistic solutions. And finally, honesty and integrity in speed discussions, not some fiction and opinion that I've seen in some places. I read not long ago that changing speed limits from 50 to 30 kilometres an hour reduces fuel use and emissions, which would be a great outcome. So I looked up the reference, and the sole justification was a modelling study where vehicles stopped every 200 metres because of congested intersections. So most of the travel was below 40 or 30 kilometres an hour anyway, and most of the benefits of reduced fuel use and therefore emissions was caused by the acceleration. There are probably many places in Sydney and Melbourne where those conditions occur at least for some time of the day, but I don't think the conclusion is widely applicable to most of Australian suburban travel. People are entitled to their own opinions. They're just not entitled to make up facts. The ACRS policy position on speed management was also endorsed last year, and it describes a holistic and comprehensive approach to speed management. I do encourage you to read it, and for those who can, I hope that you will be able to apply it, and I hope others will be able to apply it as well. I'm not going to go through it all, but it includes these elements. Firstly, the policy is multifaceted, covering all of the things that you would expect: engineering, enforcement, education, but also other things like incentives, influences, economics that Max is going to talk about, and more. The policy also recognises the roles and contributions of multiple participants for things like setting the road function by land use and transport planners, defining the speed limit by road managers and designers, engineering the road, obviously the road engineers, informing and educating drivers by any numbers of people involved in education and training, and enforcement. And finally, policy. It includes policy issues like applying new technology. So I've given you a few things to think about as an introduction. I'll stop now and look forward to questions and comments, and hand back to either Max or Catherine. If you want to contact me anytime, please do. There's contact details there, but I'm sure you can find ways to find me. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for listening to me.
Thanks, Brett. That was excellent. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions later, so thank you very much for that. Our next speaker probably needs no introduction, but I will introduce him, and that is our very own Emeritus Professor Max Cameron, PhD, who has recently retired but is probably busier than ever. So Max was a professor in the Monash University Accident Research Centre, Newark, where he worked since 1990. He holds BSc and MSc degrees in statistics and a PhD for his thesis on methods of evaluation of road trauma countermeasures. He is also a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society in the UK. Max has provided consultancy advice to the European Commission, DGTREN, through the EU Safety Ratings Advisory Committee, the SWAV Institute for Road Safety Research in the Netherlands, the Government of the Republic of Ireland, the KwaZulu-Natal Provincial Government in South Africa, and the Land Transport Safety Authority in New Zealand, and obviously many road safety agencies throughout Australia. So please welcome Max, and hopefully Max is getting ready with his slides to start. And at the end, as I said, we will have Q&A at the end for both Max and Brett. Okay.
Good. Thank you, Catherine. And from what you've heard from Brett, I guess the first question is, why don't we just reduce speeds and speed limits to facilitate that and any stronger enforcement? Well, I think it's important to recognise that the road transport system has enormous value and speed is an essential part of that. And some people interpret that in terms of travel time. And travel time does have value. In urban areas, yes, it's questionable, but on rural highways, getting from A to B, especially for commercial vehicles carrying freight or even for business travellers, it's a value. There is a cost of a longer travel time. And if you look at this chart that I'm about to put up, yes, I hope you can see that.
Yep.
You'll see that there's essentially a balance to be achieved between the increasing role of more road trauma as speed increases in any road situation, and the decreasing role of travel time in terms of travel time savings. And the type of analysis that could be done balances these two, and you can achieve so-called optimal speeds. And in this particular example, it would seem that about 76 kilometres per hour. But that's just a crude example, and I'm going to show you something a bit more specific. So if we look at, I'm trying to get my slides to change. The first question that comes, of course, what value do we place on preventing road trauma? Now, traditionally in Australia, for many decades, we use the so-called human capital method. And that essentially treats a human as a productive enterprise. And you can see that the sorts of figures of no more than 3 million in terms of valuing our human life were quite common and still are if you looked at more recent estimates of that value of a human life. But in recent years in Australia and in other countries, the so-called willingness to pay value to prevent these deaths and serious injuries has become very much the way that policymakers are thinking. And that's certainly the standard in most Australian states at this stage. And you can see a figure of the order of 8 million for the value of a human life. And these days that would be well over 10 million. And very recently, the New Zealand government has revised its estimates of willingness to pay and has come up with a figure of over 14 million. So what difference do these figures make? Well, they certainly make a difference in terms of the value you place on reducing road trauma. However, there's also other costs. There's the cost of vehicle operating costs. And you can see that in this particular diagram, the higher lines here are basically heavy commercial vehicles. And you can see that, first of all, the costs per kilometre are so much higher than for passenger cars and light commercial vehicles, and rise rapidly as speed increases. And it's one of the reasons why the value of travel time is also needs to be supplemented by vehicle operating costs. And last but not least, you have the question of the cost of air pollution emissions and its function of speed. Now, this is much more complicated, but the key ones relate to fuel consumption and from that fuel, carbon dioxide emissions. And it no doubt increases with speed, as you can see to some extent in this diagram. But all the other air pollution emissions, which have various functions with speed, generally increase as the speeds increase. So what we've done in some analysis for Australia is put together charts of this type. And we've considered a whole range of different types of roads, but this is your typical undivided roads in Australia, that we have many of them throughout our country. Most of them have a speed limit of 100 kilometres per hour. More and more these days have a speed limit of 80, and that's, I think, probably the right direction. Because, as you can see, when you add up all these costs, and you can see the vehicle operating costs, the bottom part of this chart, which increase with speed. The time costs decrease with speed, but added to those two are the road trauma costs and the air pollution emissions. And that then means that the minimum of these total costs occurs in Australia at about 90 kilometres per hour for cars and light commercial vehicles. However, when you turn to trucks, much the same picture occurs. You can see the enormous contribution of vehicle operating costs and even their air pollution emissions, and not so much the road trauma costs, but together these various costs suggest that the optimum speed, the one that minimises the total cost to society, occurs at a speed about 85 kilometres per hour. Now, this is on roads where typically the same speed limit would apply to trucks as it does to cars. And we've done this type of analysis for various quality of roads throughout Australia. The freeways and divided roads, you can see that using the optimum speed calculations based on the willingness to pay values suggests that only on rural freeways and only for light vehicles should we be talking about speed limits as in excess of 100k. And in nearly every other case, basically speed limits should be no more than 90. I think this is the case for the reinstatement of the 90 kilometre per hour speed limit in Australia. And to be certain about covering the full range of rural undivided roads, maybe a speed limit of 80 is about right. This compares with the historical speed limits based on the human capital costs. And you can see that in most of those road types, a speed limit of around 100 is not too far wrong as far as the light vehicles are concerned, but only on the very highest quality freeways should trucks be doing 100k. Now, in New Zealand's case, this is again reflecting very recent research, and bearing in mind the value that they have now put on valuing a saving in a human life at over 14 million. You can see that on their fairly standard undivided roads, that the optimum speed is something between 70 and 75 kilometres per hour for light vehicles. And in the case of trucks, between 65 and 70 kilometres per hour. And I thought this was a very useful finding in the sense that it complements the safe system speed that Brett mentioned earlier. And basically what Brett was saying, that in the case of a road environment where a head-on crash is possible, in other words, an undivided road generally, the safe system speed would probably be 70 kilometres per hour. And on the basis of these calculations for New Zealand, it would seem that not only is it the appropriate speed in the safe system thinking, but it's also the economically optimal speed of about 70 kilometres per hour, maybe even less in the case of trucks, but about right for light commercial vehicles. I'll leave it there and happily take some questions.
Thank you, Max. Very interesting to see see it all in graph form. It's fantastic. So I am going to hand it to Chris Harrison to handle the Q&A side of things. So if you haven't already put your questions in the chat, please do so now. I think we've got a couple of questions there, Chris, and I will hand over to you.
First. Thank you, Brett and Max. We have got one question in the chat box at the moment, and what I will do with people that have got questions, if you can unmute yourself, Blair, and perhaps ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks both Brett and Max. Great material there. The questions around the figures Max showed on the costs for safety, which we use willingness to pay or human capital. But then for the emissions side, and particularly the journey time side, we use a different metric completely. And yeah, there's historic reasons for that, I guess. But I really wonder what would be the implications if we switched to, say, a willingness to pay valuation for journey times. And I'd suspect, and it is speculation, but I'd suspect that the value would drop quite substantially, that people don't value a 2-second saving time very much, and would have a very low value on that. But yeah, any research you've seen where they've tried to do that, or any thoughts about what the implications would be? Thanks.
I could perhaps comment on that one, Brett.
Well,
yeah, well, as I said in my introduction, the analysis I presented today, I think is only about rural roads, and only on rural roads am I confident that the trip journeys are long enough for a marginal saving to be valued in at least the driver's mind, and in the case of commercial vehicles, the trucking companies' values. In urban areas, yes, you're right, Blair, that the journeys are generally so short that the savings are typically in the orders of seconds rather than minutes. But on a rural journey of, say, many hundreds of kilometres, the savings in travel time are substantial and have real value.
Brett, did you have anything to add there, Brett, from your perspective?
No, I've thought about this question before, and it's a very good question. Some of it relates to what are the costs involved in whichever methodology you use, because the travel time costs are not necessarily all of the costs in the travel, and the way we value them can be tricky. I do support comparing apples with apples, which is why it's a valid question. They go partly to the difference between perception and reality, if you like. Willingness to pay is a measure of the willingness to avoid risk, not necessarily the willingness to actually contribute monetarily. But the time value can be monetized more easily than the perception value. So it's a tricky question, but a very valid one. Thanks.
To add to what I said before, the recent New Zealand escalation of the values placed on road trauma, the surveys done to make those estimates also include questions aimed at trying to value additional travel time or reductions in travel time, and that resulted in the estimates being of the order of 50% larger than what New Zealand had been using previously. And I should also add that when it came to valuing a fatal crash, the escalation in values was of the order of 3 times what had been previously used. So yes, these values do change, and I think reflecting the greater emphasis that society is placing on preventing road trauma, it was appropriate for New Zealand to increase the values. But we need to bear in mind that at least the New Zealand population puts now greater value on travel time savings than it traditionally did. And that's why the calculations were newly done for New Zealand, because the values had changed.
Thanks, Max. We have got another question. There's also another comment from Blair, but Wendy, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Brett, I have met before, so it's Wendy from Get Around Cabo Car Free. I was really interested in, so we're very interested in active and public transport, people walking and cycling, those sorts of things. Can you hear me okay, by the way?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And I just was interested in this 50 kilometers an hour, because we see those, the way that's calculated, you know, even on dual carriageway streets in a fairly busy, in an urban area, sort of like what would sometimes be called a strode. So having those higher speeds and the cost, the monetary impact of that, how has that been calculated and included?
Max, Brett?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Max. It's not a question that I've heard about, but there's some validity in it. So I haven't heard an answer about it. I haven't even heard the question asked, but I think it's a good question to ask. And hi, Wendy, you're doing great work up there at Cabo. I'll leave it to Max.
Wendy, I'm sorry, there's a bit of noise in the background here, and I was a bit distracted. Just a brief summary of what you said again, please. The key points. You're on mute, by the way. Wendy, you're on mute.
That's okay. I've got it. So what I was asking is, in suburban areas, and so I live on a 50-kilometer street in my little home street, and then about 50 meters up the road is a sort of, what would you call it, a strode. So it's a dual carriageway divided in the middle. And by the fact that cars go at 50 kilometers an hour or 60 kilometers an hour, it means that anybody who's walking or cycling, riding, you know, wheelchairs or whatever, that makes it really dangerous for them. So it becomes a human cost at that stage. And so I wanted to know what the calculations are on speed for inhibiting other transport modes that are not cars.
Yeah, well, I think the general approach at the moment is for the cars to be constrained to speeds at which, if they impact with the so-called unprotected road users, which are pedestrians, bicyclists, and even motorcyclists, that won't result in a serious injury outcome. And the general thinking is that an impact at anything above 30 kilometres per hour has a substantial risk of a fatal outcome. And anything above 50 is almost certain to result in fatal outcomes. Now, of course, the environments you described, it sound like a combination of residential streets and the arterial roads that are used to connect between the residential areas. And the general theory of road management, and I think it's typified by roads in the Netherlands, is that the idea is to move people from the residential streets to the higher speed, long distance roads as quickly as possible. But they shouldn't attempt to do long journeys on residential streets. And the argument goes even further to say that they should move from the arterial roads to the higher quality freeways and motorways.
I've been searching constantly for the last hour.
Where they typically have a speed limit of 100 kilometres per hour. And
what frustrates me is that
it's a road
I'm seeing
hierarchy
your Zoom
concept.
thing as well. So,
And you either subscribe to it or
I had
you
that room
don't.
set up, and then
But
Charlie or someone's dumped stuff in there.
If you
sorry, Max, can I just interrupt you? Someone's if you could mute yourself if you're not asking the question, because we can hear some background speaking.
thank you, Catherine. I wasn't sure what was happening there. And the road hierarchy concept, I think, is a good one. But at the end of the day, some people do want to move at higher speeds than the 30k that's appropriate for residential streets. And you get across town, and you see this particularly in the United States, where in most cases when people want to move from one side of a suburban area to another side, they will use a freeway, and they will drop down to the residential roads for the last part of the journey, and tolerate that because they've achieved nearly all their journey and at a minimum time on the higher quality road that's appropriate for the high speeds that a freeway allows. Now, cyclists and pedestrians, of course, it's a very desirable activity, but we don't allow them to be on motorways and freeways. And there is serious moves, I think, to make it almost a divided road on the arterial roads, with the ideas of separated, protected bicycle lanes running between the pedestrian paths and the vehicle paths. And that's where I think we really need to go, because you do need to have some arterial roads, and cyclists tend to want to use them as well. So a road hierarchy in that road space where the pedestrians are protected by the curb, the gutter, the cyclists are protected by the bicycle lanes, protected bicycle lanes, and the cars are only in their road space and can't enter the pedestrian space or the bicycle space, I think is very much the functional way it should all operate. Others around the table or listening to this may have much better ways of describing what I've just described, but it seems to me that practice in the Netherlands is very much along those lines.
Thank you, Max. And we're definitely happy for anyone to bring their perspectives into the discussion as well. Kathy, I see a question from you.
Well, yeah, mine was just are we seeing a shift in the willingness of the public to reduce speeds, do you think? And I guess not just the public, but government as well. So
well, I don't think we are seeing it yet.
Okay.
And I think the argument that reductions in speed cost us too much time really needs to be challenged. And the sort of calculations I've shown, they're difficult to do in urban areas, but they should be done, really are aimed at saying this is not just a debating point, this is just economics.
Yep.
That society needs to recognise that travel time doesn't have infinite value. Others would like us to believe that road trauma or the prevention thereof has infinite value. Therefore, we should do whatever we can in terms of speed reduction. But some sort of rational economic debate, I think, is called for. Now, not everyone is comfortable with that sort of debate, but I am. I'm happy with it.
That's good.
So I'll give you a couple of comments. Firstly, I don't really know because like a lot of professionals and people in their own sphere of interest, I live in a bit of a bubble. So I don't know what the whole of the world is talking about and what the appetite is for a lot of different things, including speed. I think we have to be careful in our profession that we don't espouse a position and expect everybody just to accept it, or even that people have heard it all. We need to get out there and have the discussions, the dialogue, like Max describes. And to that point, just for fun, a bit provocatively, I posted on LinkedIn today, instead of the Fatal 5, I posted the Fatal 15. And one of the Fatal 15 is the myths that the general public believe about road safety. And one of them, for instance, is that changing speed by 100 to 110 to or 100 to 90 kilometres an hour on regional roads is going to make a lot of difference to travel time. As Blair put in the comments, it makes seconds difference, and it's less than the time it takes for you to stop and buy your ice cream or fill up with fuel that we don't value the same. So I'm sure we need much more public debate and dialogue about the issue.
And I guess, that's something that I often think about, how do we get the information to the community to see what are some of the perceptions or, the misperceptions that people might have. I mean, in one of our programs, we often hear people, talking very negatively about all the reductions in speed, and it is due to that time in getting there. People still believe that the quicker you go, the quicker you're going to get somewhere.
Yeah. And in urban areas, that needs to be challenged. But you shouldn't reach the same conclusion for rural travel. I think that's a bit more subtle.
How do we challenge that in the community? What are some thoughts from people around challenging that?
There's a new question from Tia.
Tia, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, sorry, my cat did something to my camera, so
I love it.
yeah, I'm reflecting, sitting here thinking about everyone talking about all these sort of nuanced costs, and I'm just wanting to highlight that I'm currently working on a matter that happened approximately 11 years ago. I think this is the third, fourth, possibly fifth time it's gone through the court system. And I'm just curious how well, and it is a speed related case, I will say, how well these costs are reflected. That's all I wanted to ask. I'm not quite sure.
Thanks, Tia. Brett, Max?
Yeah, well, the costs, the human capital costs, I think, in a legal sense, are unchallengeable. They're really just saying that a human has at least the value of what they produce, as reflected by their wages. And in the case of a fatal crash or a person who has permanent disability, you can calculate that. But when you get to the willingness to pay estimates, they aim to reflect what a reasonable person in society thinks is the value of preventing a death or a serious injury as defined. Now, whether they achieve that is a good question. And I say that with some caution because there are many studies done in Australia and New Zealand and overseas that come up with very, very different values for the willingness to pay estimates. But that's not to say that we should ignore them, because you recall from my second chart that the willingness to pay figures are almost an order of magnitude larger than the human capital methods, at least 3 or 4 times anyway. And they change the economics of the calculations that I showed you. They're the main reason why the optimum speeds are lower than the traditional speed limits that we decided as a society decades ago were appropriate for our speed limits, at least on undivided roads in Australia and New Zealand. And if society is really valuing road trauma as much as we purport to be, especially in our quest to achieve a zero road toll, then the implications are that it makes economic good sense to drive slower. And any perception that it's become an unreasonable cost to mobility really needs to be challenged.
And I guess as Tia has kind of talked about the ongoing court costs, like, you know, you think of all the costs that are associated with people who have died or seriously injured on our road, and in conjunction with speed, you know, it's way more than the environmental and the physical. You know, you've got a whole heap of trajectories that people go on after an incident like that costs the community so much more, that sometimes people don't even think of what some of those costs might be. That's just my perspective on that one. Brett?
Yeah, so in principle, Tia's right. We should include all costs in whatever analysis we're doing, and that rarely occurs, sometimes because we can't monetize things, quantify them. Sometimes they're subjective, they're very variable. There's a whole range of different issues, and that's a whole discussion in itself. I suspect that court costs are a low proportion of the total cost, because not very many crash issues go to court, either through the regulatory enforcement system or through the civil system in terms of compensation. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be included, in, at least in principle. But the greater issue perhaps is the one about perception, which Mark Newsom also raised a bit earlier, that people's perceptions vary, and therefore we can personally value things. Perceptions are subjective and they defy monetization. So that makes it very difficult to analyse in terms of econometrics. So I'll give you this example. In developing countries, road safety costs are arguably a lot lower, because the value of human life is very low in some of these countries. Whereas in Australia, we give it a relatively high value because we love each other and our mums and dads or kids or friends or whoever it is. Whereas in some of the developing countries, it's not that they value their friends and family any less, but in economic terms, life is much more expendable. So the valuation of human life can be very different in different circumstances and for different people.
Yeah, I agree with Brett on that, and I think in some recent involvement I had with the World Bank, and Blair, I think, knows more about it than I do. It troubled me when we were talking about the sorts of analysis I showed you earlier, trying to do it in the low-income countries. Do they really have values that they put on saving human lives to the same extent as the high-income countries? And I think that we as consultants tended to argue that it's a sort of a moral position. They should value them that highly, like the high-income countries. But in practice, I don't think it's true.
Yeah.
Thank you. Just want to go back to Mark. Mark, do you want to speak to the couple of comments that you've made to bring into this discussion? Mark Newsom.
Sorry, I'm just on the move at the moment, but yeah, my experience is that people generally value their the perception of their travel time more than the travel time itself. They won't think, they'll think that reducing a speed limit is bad because they're going to take longer to get where they're going, and it's going to have such a significant impact on their journey time. But then they wouldn't think twice about, like Brent mentioned earlier, stopping to get petrol or stopping at a set of signals or something like that. These things all can add minutes to their journeys, and what they're actually seeing in actual travel time can be a lot less while they're out on the road, seconds. And that's what we found when we measured it. When we looked at the 110k speed limits here in New Zealand, we did a study. We asked people what they thought they were saving, and we got the mode response was 5 minutes, but we had answers as high as 10 and 15 minutes. And then we actually went out and measured it. And granted that the lengths weren't exactly the same, our measurement was 22 seconds. So, yeah, people's perception of that time saving is, I suppose it's a freedom to travel at a speed that they choose rather than a restriction that they're valuing.
Yeah. And my guess also is that depending on how time poor people are as to how they value the time saved. So if you've got plenty of time, it's the value of it is significantly lower mentally, if you like.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
If you're rushing to catch a ferry, then seconds count. But if you've got 15 minutes till your ferry and you're 10 minutes away, then you're not going to be bothered by it.
No, exactly. And you'll have a much nicer journey too.
Thank you.
Can I just put up one of my charts again? Can you see it there?
Yeah.
Yeah. If you look at that line, the blue line, it's about travel time. You can see that because it's a so-called inverse function, that the difference in travel time, if you went from 100 to say 120, is very little. That sounds like a 20% increase, doesn't it? It's just not a 20% decrease in travel time at all. And it's the nature of the function.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're just about need to wrap it up now. But I'd like to thank both of our speakers today for their time and for all of you for attending. Thank you, Chris, for looking after the Q&A. We will have some further lunchbox chats, so keep an eye out in your mailbox and also on the ACRS events page. I think this Thursday is the ACRS Systems Safety Workshop that Brett was referring to earlier, and of course all the AGMs are coming up as well, so definitely keep an eye out and register for those events. If you have a future topic that you would like covered or suggested speakers, we would love to hear from you, so you can email us at vic@acrs.org.au, or you can email Chris Harrison, our chair, at Amber Community. So we'd love to hear your suggestions because we want to give people what they want to hear. You will be receiving an evaluation form from National Office, and we would ask that it's only a few questions. We'd love your feedback on it, and that's also where you could put suggestions for future events. Thanks everyone for your attendance, and hope to see you next time, and drive safely. Thanks again to Max and Brett.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.